From the Historyogi podcast, this is Dave. Singapore's old guard leaders are well known as politicians and cabinet ministers, but the 10 of them also had lesser known passions and careers beyond politics. Today, we speak to Pei, Derek, and Jaime, co writers of the book The First Fools B Sides of Lee Kuan Yew's A Team. In this episode, we focus on three specific old guard leaders E.W. Barker, Othman and Yong Nyuk and learn about what kept them going amidst the huge challenges of Singapore's early years. Okay, welcome to the program, Pei, Derek, and Jaime.
Thanks for having us, Dev.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Dev. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Now, plenty of books have been written about the PAP Old Guard leaders. Why is it useful for Singaporeans today to understand the B sides of Lee Kuan Yew's A Team?
Well, you see, when we wanted to work on this project, it was primarily first as a sequel to our previous book, The Last Fools. So that book focused on 8 pioneer civil servants, and obviously the civil servants served and worked with the political leaders, right? And we then thought that, hey, if we're going to do a sequel, that it would be a good idea to focus on those political leaders, especially that we're going to time this new book, The First Fools, to SG60. Right. And so the whole idea was that, okay, we're going to time it to the 60th year of independence. We should be focusing on the political leaders. And in particular, let's focus on the 10 men that signed the separation agreement. Officially, I believe they signed it on August 7, 1965, before obviously Independence Day on August 9th, right? But then the question is really that, okay, you're going to talk about these old guard leaders, but as you have just pointed out, Dev, there are really quite a bit already written about, especially the more prominent ones, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam had a two-volume, very, very thick volume biography that has been released. The second volume just came out last year, if I'm not wrong. So we did not want to, retrace the same step, retell the same stories, and not to say that they're not important stories, just that they're already out there, right? The A side is already out there. And so our idea was that, can we explore a little bit more? Can we go a little bit deeper into these old guard leaders, but on the side that has not been discovered as much? Can we talk a little bit more about the side that is more personal? Instead of going into their contributions, their achievements, and their policies, not to say that those were not important, but how about we look at their hobbies? How about we look at their love life? How about we look at maybe a part of their political career that has been less focused on? For example, instead of Toh Chin Chai's years as a deputy prime minister, why not we look at the 8 very colorful years of him as an MP, as a backbencher, after he left the cabinet? So that was kind of the idea. And we thought, okay, actually, this is quite an interesting angle that we could pursue. And as we began to research, find out more about these 10 men, that's when we realized that indeed they have fascinating stories. And in finding out these so-called B-sides stories of their lives, I feel that we actually get to know these people better. So we know Raja, the diplomat, and everything that we talk about Raja is about foreign affairs, United Nations, ASEAN, Singapore, Malaysia, you name it. But how about Raja, the writer? An incredibly prolific writer. How good was he? How was he regarded in the literary world back in the day, right? So how about we find out a little bit more about that part of him, the B side of that part of Raja. And when we do that, I think that when we combine with the A side, then truly we get that full picture of Raja the man, not just Raja the politician or Raja the diplomat. And similarly, it applies to the other 9 OGAT leaders that there is captured in this book. Really is getting to know the person a little bit better. And I think that SG60, 60 years has lapsed. It is a wonderful time for Singaporeans or even for foreigners to get to know these people beyond the policies, beyond the achievements, and see them more holistically as people.
Now, how did you conduct research for the book, and what were the most surprising details you discovered?
Well, Dev, as you know, most of us are journalists, and so usually when we approach our books here at the Nut Graph, what we do is clearly research. So we'll go deep into the archives, to the old newspapers, anything, any reports, anything that we can lay our hands on. That will be the first thing that we do. But beyond that, as journalists, what we really want is to download some really good personal stories from other people who have worked with these OGAT leaders, including, of course, family members, anyone who might have interacted with them and who can tell us a little bit more about these B-sides. So we would reach out to many people that we know, friends of friends, contacts of contacts, acquaintances of acquaintances. It goes on. And the whole idea is really to hear personal memories, wonderful anecdotes that have never been captured in any of the newspaper stories, never been captured in any books prior to this, fresh, wonderful memories of these people. And I think that we've been fairly successful in reaching out to a large pool of people who could share with us some really wonderful memories. I'm going to leave it to Derek and Jaime to share a little bit more later. Derek, for example, managed to speak to the child of E.W. Barker, who could share about his father's passion for sports. And when you could get that kind of download from the child, from within the privacy of the family environment, you really get to hear a lot more things than what we would otherwise get trying to glimpse from the outside. So I would say that that's how we worked. The second part of your question, the most surprising thing, frankly, I would say that because the whole angle of this book is on B-sides, I would say that almost everything is surprising, because you might know a lot about Lee Kuan Yew, the leader, the wonderful statesman, but I'm sure you don't know the ins and outs of his romance, his love life. Some of it I'm sure we know, but there are a lot more details that we capture in this book. And it's the same with all the other leaders, because the B-sides, the starting point of this book, the starting point of this project is really trying to find out things which are lesser known. So I think we found lots of wonderful stories, things that were surprising. Maybe I just cite one here, which is on Lim Kim San, right? Everybody knows Lim Kim San, the father of our public housing policy, Mr. HDB. That's what we refer to him. But actually, from my position as a former Straits Times journalist, I've actually heard a lot more stories of Lim Kim San, the publisher, the man who ran SPH for many years and was able to really grow this newspaper company to be one of the biggest in Singapore, right? And so when he was first brought in, everyone in SPH thought that he's going to be the chief censor. He is going to be LKY's man to be clamping us down. But in the end, he turned out not to be the case, but rather paying a lot of attention to P&L, to profit and loss, paying a lot of attention to discipline, so much so that he was given the nickname of the hangman in SPH, because if you don't meet his standards, there you go. And it's got nothing to do with censorship whatsoever. It's everything to do with prudence, discipline, and are the journalists, are the people working in this company able to bring SPH to the place which I think he believed that it should be. And at its peak, SPH was one of the biggest listed company in Singapore. So that would be one thing which I guess from my position as a former Straits Times reporter, I found it very interesting and especially surprising.
Yeah, I'd like to now focus on 3 of the 10 individuals in the book: E.W. Barker, Othman Wok, and Yong Nyuk Lin. So starting with Barker, he was Singapore's longest serving law minister and drafted the Proclamation of Singapore in 1965. In First Fools, you mentioned he was also Singapore's, quote, unofficial minister for sports, unquote. How did he carve out a place in society for sports back then?
Yeah, hey Dev. Yeah, I'll take this. Derek here. So I wrote the chapter on E.W. Barker. Yes, so the moniker, right? Unofficial Minister for Sports. I think it was very much conferred on by himself. Because the opening quote really is from him that I used is, "I'd rather be a minister for sports than a minister for law or minister for labor." And we know that Barker never held a sports-related portfolio in the cabinet. Yeah, but he very much saw himself as the primary advocate for sports, in the cabinet. Yeah. So, this was really, his mindset. Sports was just oozing out of his pores. He was a natural at sports. From young, he was a champion student athlete. So that passion was clear. So even though, he primarily, was a very important figure, right, in the early cabinet, right, as law minister, he single-handedly drafted the separation agreement, with Malaysia. So, I mean, it was clear for all to see that, he was supreme, in the field of law. But I think what people may not know as much is, his B side, which is his extreme love for sports. Yeah, and let me tell you just a bit about, the times, that he was in, newly independent Singapore. So in the 60s, 70s, there was a time of survival, right? Lee Kuan Yew and his team were really just thinking about putting roofs over people's head, about putting food on the table. This was a very different Singapore from what we know now. So, in such a situation, who had time for sports, right? In fact, Lee Kuan Yew was very much public, about his opinion on sports, that, Singapore should not waste time on sports. We have a small population. There's a very, very slim chance of being champion in anything. Why should we invest in sports? So that was Lee Kuan Yew's very pragmatic mindset. But Barker, right, he sees himself as the advocate for sports. So, of course, he felt very differently. He felt that, sports, gave the countrymen, something to be proud about, right? You have everyone gathered and cheering for your own. I think he saw that is very important in nation building. Yeah, so what he did, was as Minister for National Development, he pushed very hard for the national stadium, the old Kallang Stadium, even though, it costs millions and millions of dollars. Yeah, so that was among the things he did, to advocate for sports. And many times, he even went against his boss, Lee, right? Gloria Barker, his wife, spoke about how they would have disagreements, right, in cabinet meetings. And of course, Barker wouldn't, lay out this laundry in public lah. But, he would go back, tell his wife after a long day, that, he was fighting so hard for the stadium. And of course, in the end, it was built and it really set the infrastructure lah, for sports in Singapore, among many other things lah. Yeah. So that was Barker lah. Yeah, how he carved out a place in society for sports. And I think today, the likes of Joseph Schooling, Shanti Pereira, Loh Kian Yew, they really they may not know Barker himself, but thanks to him, he really set the path for professional sportsmen in Singapore when, back in the 60s, 70s, this was inconceivable, even frowned upon, right, by Lee himself. So I think he did a lot for sports, or as you say, the unofficial minister for sports. Yeah.
The book also describes how Barker tried to get the Asian Games to be hosted in Singapore. Could you just share a bit more about that whole thing?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I think he was going for the 1978 Asian Games, right? And I think one way, right, he really wanted to put Singapore on the sporting map was to host such major games, major international games, and then you have some fanfare, excitement about it, and already also for the sports people in Singapore, the Singapore athletes to perform, the major games in front of a packed stadium, that would do a lot for national pride. So about the Asian Games, so remember I talked about, how he built the stadium, right? He really pushed hard. And a big reason why he did so was so that Singapore had the infrastructure to host such games because you needed, capacities of 50,000. You need a proper indoor arena, swimming pools, and so on, which Singapore, of course, at that time lacked. And it would be very expensive to build this. So, we actually successfully hosted, the 1973 Southeast Asian Games or the SEAP Games, then as it was known then. And then Barker went for more. So you see in the book that, I talked about how as a hockey player, sometimes he pushed, right? So in this case, he went on the offensive, right? He thought, okay, let's go for more. Let's go for the Asian Games. So he himself, he's a lawyer, he's very well spoken. So he personally, as president of the Singapore National Olympic Council then, right? He personally went to went to Munich, right, Munich, where the Olympic Games was, and made a personal pitch, right, to the Olympic Committee there, right, to allow Singapore to host the Asian Games. And Singapore was actually up against a very impressive competition in the form of Fukuoka from Japan, right? The city in Japan, very beautiful coastal city. Yeah, but in the end, the panel was swayed by Barker's persuasion, right? He promised that, Singapore, could provide the facilities. He actually made a great case, as a lawyer for Singapore, and they won the pitch. But as we approached the games, right, this was also a time when Singapore was facing a construction issue, right, a labor shortage. And then Singapore had to make a choice, right, between choosing to build indoor arenas for millions or, building more housing. And in the end, sadly, we had to go, with the needs of the people, which Barker, very much acknowledged at the time. So he had to concede that, okay, maybe we have to give up the Asian Games. So very sadly, right, he had to, go and concede lah, and say that actually, later on that Singapore won't be able to host this. Yeah, but we were close. We were close, yeah, to hosting the Asian Games. Yeah, so that was the episode. Yeah, so I mean, the takeaway from this really is, how Barker, was so impressive in his sway, right? He was speaker in parliament, right? He had this charisma about him that he was able to make a case for Singapore to host the Asian Games, right, against a very, very stiff competition. I mean, all signs pointed to Fukuoka, to host the Asian Games of 1978. But Barker, with his stature, right, and with his charisma, was able to wrest over the bid. Yeah, and that was actually publicly acknowledged by the decision makers then. Yeah, so that was the episode lah.
Okay, now we move on to Othman Wok. Now, he is best known for serving as Singapore's Minister for Social Affairs, but he also achieved fame for writing Malay ghost stories after getting the opportunity from none other than Yusof Ishak himself. How did this all happen?
Hey, hi Dev, Jaime here. I wrote this chapter on Othman Walk. So I think how it all happened was quite serendipitous actually. So at first, Othman was hired as an administrative staff for the newspaper that Yusof Ishak, our first president, co-founded, which was called Utusan Melayu back then and Utusan Malaysia today. But one day, this other reporter got sacked by Yusof, and Othman just so happened to be at the scene. And Yusof was like, hey, do you want to work in the editorial department? And Othman just said yes. So that's how his career as a journalist started. But the ghost stories part only came 6 years later in 1952. So in 1952, the newspaper was experiencing a pretty bad dip in sales. And to increase viewership, Yusof came up with the idea of publishing ghost stories in both the Sunday edition of the paper as well as the monthly entertainment magazine that the paper owned. And there was just simply no better person to ask than Othman because he was someone who grew up listening to and telling these stories within his community. And in fact, it's believed that many of his stories were inspired by real-life supernatural encounters that he had, one of which happened when he was staying in a bungalow on the Istana compound. But I shall not share spoilers, I must read the book to find out. So, sure enough, circulation tripled. And then one question might be, why ghost stories? Like, why not anything else? And why were they so popular? In Othman's own words, Malays just love stories like these. So tales of the supernatural were not like so much superstitions, but a very integral part of kampong life back then, and people would legitimately gather in the evenings around a kerosene lamp just to trade, these ghost stories. And in fact, today, I would say for many of us, whether we believe in ghosts or not, we also err on the side of caution, right? Like, for example, we'll knock before entering a hotel room, or avoid pointing at the moon or breaking a mirror, that kind of thing. And these stories were apparently so horrifying that a lot of readers wrote in to be like, can you stop writing, please? Because, my wife or my daughter is very scared to go to the kitchen or to take a bath at night. Because in those days, bathrooms and kitchens were generally located outside the main house. Yeah, so assuming that Othman had a weekly quota at Utusan Zaman, which was the Sunday newspaper, he must have published over 200 stories in his most active years as a writer. And ironically, this so-called side gig was what made him a household name. So he didn't get a byline for a lot of his scoops as a reporter, but he did for writing these ghost stories. Yeah, and later on, when he became Minister for Social Affairs in 1963, he unfortunately had to step down from writing and journalism to the shock of many of his friends and colleagues who thought that he would really just stay in that profession forever. But even so, he continued to write late at night as a way to wind down after like a 12-hour shift of, ministerial duties. And after he retired from politics in 1981, to nobody's surprise, he went straight back to writing ghost stories. And this time it was for another Sunday newspaper under Utusan Malaysia also, but it was called Mingguan Malaysia. So all these stories came out before books like Russell Lee's True Singapore Ghost Stories or James Lee's Mr. Midnight series in the late 80s. So in a way, Othman was really a pioneer in the local horror scene, whether he knew it or not. And his daughter, Lily Othman, correctly predicted this spike in demand for horror in the 80s. And the reason why we can even read all these stories from all the way back is because of her. So, as Pei said just now, we were very lucky to have been able to interview her for this book. And she was the one who pushed for her father's stories to be compiled into an actual anthology format. Otherwise, they were just, serialized stories in newspapers and magazines. And she really went to very great lengths to get these stories published. So, like, from convincing her father that it was even a worthwhile endeavor, and then after getting his permission, she had to like travel down to KL to, get the rights for the stories, and go down to the warehouse in which all these newspapers were stacked to like manually sift through and find the stories that she needed. And after that, it was a whole process of translation, editing, getting illustrators, publishing, etc., etc. So without her efforts, it's very likely that these tales would have been lost to time. Yeah.
So now we come to the third individual, Yong who is perhaps the least well-known of the 10 individuals featured in First Fools. What were his major political contributions, and could you explain his relationship with Lee Kuan Yew?
Well, Dev, Yong Lin is just go with me a little bit here. So Yong Lin's wife is the sister of Lee Kuan Yew's wife. Lee Kuan Yew, in a way, fell in love with his wife through Yong Lin. So that, in a way, is the connection. And he was an insurance man. He's always been in the business, and that's what he saw, what he was going to do for the rest of his life. But because of this new brother-in-law who became the prime minister of a new country, needing help, needing good men, he chose to leave his profession and join politics. And I think he was a minister for slightly more than 10 years. And after that, he retired. And the reason why he's the least well-known, I think, has a lot to do with what he did post-retirement, which was pretty much disappear from public view. And did not do another interview, did not even do a oral history interview with the National Archives, And so I think that pretty much, I would say from the 1980s onwards, you hardly will hear anything about this man. So no surprise that now, 40 years later or so, we hardly anyone know of this man. In terms of his political contributions, I would say that there are plenty. There are really quite a bit because after all, he was a minister for more than 10 years. But here, perhaps I would just like to point to one example. And back in the day, it was referred to as the Area Licensing Scheme, or ALS. And what it meant was that you needed to pay extra money to get into the CBD. You have to pay extra money if you want to drive into the CBD, which was at that point something new. But as Singapore was getting more affluent, more congestion, more cars going to the CBD, and so he came up with this scheme, which was of course highly unpopular. But that was the predecessor to what we know today as ERP. So, Yong is the guy who pretty much got us going on this ERP scheme back from I believe it was late 1970s.
Now, we have spoken about the PAP Old Guard that are featured in First Fools. Now, if I were to switch the focus slightly to the 2G or 3G leadership, and if you had to pick someone from our 2G or 3G leadership to write about their B side, who would it be and why?
I think I would struggle to pick people from the 2G or 3G leadership to write about their B side because for many of them, we haven't even gotten to the proper A side, And as the concept of the B-side would suggest on a vinyl record, that, well, people usually buy the vinyl record for the A side first before turning it around and discovering something, a deep cut or something, an unreleased single that is called the B side, right? But in the first place, you got to get the A side. And I think that let's talk a little bit about the 2G leadership. Yeah, we have someone like the former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong. I wrote 2 volumes of his biography. We have Dr. Tony Tan recently releasing something, releasing his memoirs, of his political journey. I think it was last year or so. But by and large, if you think back to the 2G leaders, many of them have not really told their stories in a way that many of us would have liked. As Dana Balan, for example, Mr. Ong Teng Cheong, Dr. Shah, right? I don't think we have heard their A side yet, or at least I haven't. Maybe some people with the access or privilege of being very close to them would have heard. I certainly haven't, and I think for the vast majority of Singaporeans, we haven't as well. So, and we're only talking about the second generation. Let's not even go to the 3G yet, because after all, 3G Prime Minister just stepped down not too long ago, right? So I think that before we get to the B side, it is important that we first know about the A side of their stories. The reason why we are now talking about the B sides of the OGAT leaders is because, like Dev, as you've said at the start, it is that quite a lot has already been written about the OGAT leaders' A side. So now go to the B side, and I think that works. But otherwise, I think as a people, as a country, we need to know the A side stories first, because that is really the meat of what informs us about these personalities to begin with.
Well, Dev, if I could offer someone, I think it would be Taman. Because I think, so actually, when I was interviewing a journalist, Ken Jale Jr., for about Barker, because he was a sports journalist, he said that the, current, the contemporary, politician who most reminded him of Barker was actually Taman Shanmugaratnam, our president. And I think there are similarities, So I've never seen Barker in person, but people said he had that swagger, he had that charisma, and of course he played hockey. I think Taman was an excellent sportsman as well, and of course a poet, right? So I think he would be someone I have in mind definitely if I would talk about his B side.
Yeah, I mean, just off the top of my head, I didn't put a lot of thought into this, but maybe like Lee Hsien Loong, the mathematician, because everyone knows he's like a math prodigy and, graduated top of his class at Cambridge. And I think he was asked before if he regretted not becoming a mathematician, and he said no. But like, really? And he's always posting nerdy math stuff on his Facebook, some new method to derive quadratic equations or something. I remember seeing that. Yeah, so I think that would be pretty fun to write. But yeah, as Pei said, he just stepped down. So yeah, not so soon.